For allowing me to be with you. Believe it or not, this is fun for me. I want to tell you about an author. His name's Bruce Feiler. He's a New York Times bestselling author. You may have read some of his books before. He's written Walking the Bible, which is a series, America's Prophet, and Abraham. He's a writer, he's a researcher, and he's a storyteller, a meaning maker. And he wrote this little book right here, which I'm going to hold up, called Life is in the Transitions. Central to this book is Feiler's analysis of more than 300 life stories that he collected from across the country over many years of effort. And in this book, he takes the complex web of choices, relationships, and actions that comprise the fabric of our lives, and he picks a little bit at those threads to try to understand a little bit more. How does life happen? What is life? What does it feel like? And what Feiler found is that life is far more chaotic than we like to admit that it is. Life is full of what Feiler calls disruptors. These are events or experiences that interrupt the everyday flow of one's life. These can be happy events, like a promotion at work. That's a disruptor. Events like getting engaged. Events like coming out of an addiction cycle. These can be events we wouldn't choose, like deteriorating joint health, being fired or furloughed from work, or finding out that a family member has tumbled into a deep, dark depression. These events can also feel neutral, though they're no less disruptive, like finding our spiritual habits shifting, like moving to a new place because your lease was up. Feiler's research shows that the average adult has experienced 30 to 40 disruptors over the course of their lives, with that number jumping up or down depending on age. In other words, on average, we can expect to experience a disruptor in our life every 12 to 18 months. Yeah. And in a world that preaches to us that absolute security, that control is not only possible but admirable, we can own a home or several. We can earn our way to financial security. And we can always log in to dependable old Netflix for a few hours of entertaining dissociation from the world. This idea, in this world, the idea that chaos rumbles through our lives on an almost yearly basis, that's pretty disturbing. That's something I want to look away from. And it gets worse. Feiler talks about another breed of chaos that visits our life. Lifequakes is what he calls them. Lifequakes. A lifequake, Feiler defines as a forceful burst of change in one's life that leads to a period of upheaval, transition, and renewal. Lifequakes run the gamut from personal to collective, and from voluntary to involuntary. You can almost picture 4 quadrants on those 2 axes. The war in Ukraine is a lifequake. It is a collective, involuntary lifequake for the people of Ukraine and for many others who experience the fallout effects of there not being enough grain, for example. Those of you who have ever lost a spouse or have been served divorce papers, you have experienced a personal, involuntary lifequake. Those of you who have had an affair or quit a career or had a baby have experienced a personal, voluntary lifequake, a chosen lifequake. Infertility, miscarriage, cancer, economic downturn, sexual abuse, public shaming or humiliation, becoming an empty nester, that's a lifequake. Retirement, graduating from school, any stage of school, pandemics, war, partisan politics, crime, mental health crisis. Life is tumultuous. It's full of life quakes. And we don't have the power, nor sometimes the will, to control most of them. Filer's research shows that even young people, those in their teens and their 20s, have been through a life quake or two. Those of you who are over 40, you've probably been through 3, 5, 7 life quakes. And those of you who are even older and even wiser, I suspect you have been through even more. Disruptors and life quakes. Life is tumultuous. And try as we might, we don't have the power to control it. I want to tell you a story I heard yesterday morning. I was driving with a friend, and suddenly he started weeping because one of his friends had suddenly become a widower. This young man is the father of 2 children under 3, and his wife had died from brain cancer very suddenly. Life is tumultuous, and try as we might, we don't have the power to control that. And this is precisely where Naomi and Ruth and Orpah find themselves as we turn to our passage in Ruth. They're living in the unstable aftermath of a cluster of life quakes. For starters, the region they live in is in famine. There isn't food. And I think most biblical scholars would rightly ask us if we understand that when we read it. Because for most of us, I suspect the most painful famine experience we've had is when the grocery store is out of an item we needed to make our recipe. For most of us who have lived life above the poverty line in America, hunger isn't something we're likely to have experienced unless we've chosen to diet or fast weekly. And I do want to say, if you're listening today and you do get famine and you do get hunger on a more visceral level, my heart breaks that the wickedness and chaos of this world has meant hunger pangs for you or for those that you love. And I do hope and pray that your belly never goes hungry again. But there are more life quakes in the verses that precede today's passage. Some of them you heard about last week. Naomi lives in a foreign land because her husband moved them to Moab. That's a life quake. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies. Naomi's a widow. Naomi's sons have married foreign women. That was not advisable for that culture in the day. And then Naomi's sons, the husbands of her daughters-in-law, have also died. So Naomi's far from home, in a land with no food. She's widowed, and her only blood children are dead. All that remains is her daughters-in-law, who themselves are living amidst famine as childless widows. And I want to just for a second sit down with them, perhaps at a dusty table where they dip small stale portions of bread into water, taking small bites and chewing over long in hopes that that would take the edge off of the hunger. What could we possibly say to this group of hungry widows in that moment? What hope could we possibly offer them? I gotta confess, as somebody who now has a pastor's education and a reasonable amount of practice walking with people in hard things, I'm not sure I could believe any words of hope that I would offer to them. They are in a dark place, and beyond the threshold of that dark place, out into the future, surely there's only more darkness. What would tell us otherwise? As I was praying over this passage and spending some time imagining and inhabiting this story, it struck me that Naomi and Ruth and Orpah, in a different way, may have been feeling a lot like the disciples felt as Jesus gave up those last breaths on the cross, as he was laid to rest in a tomb, and as the dark uncertainty of Holy Saturday broke over them. Darkness, chaos, loss, wickedness, and a whole bag of uncertainty. I want to ask you, where in your own life do you find yourself amidst chaos and darkness and uncertainty? Where in your own life are you experiencing or have you experienced a disruptor or a life quake that's got you wondering what's next? Hold that in your mind as we pivot to this passage. So in the first verse of our passage in Ruth 1:6, it's Naomi. Remember, this is a slowly starving widow who has just lost her children. It's Naomi who sees a glimmer of light and chooses to walk towards it. Naomi hears that God has provided food, a break in the famine, for the people of her old homeland, the land of Judah, in which we find the little town of Bethlehem. So she and Ruth and Orpah pack it up, and they head out on the really rough overland journey back to Judah. And though Judah holds only the merest hint of hope, God's grace is there, and Naomi steps towards that loving kindness, towards that hesed that God is delivering to the people of Judah. So on they walk until something shifts in Naomi, and she begins to speak to Ruth and Orpah. I haven't called Orpah Oprah yet, but it's going to happen at some point. So Naomi does three things. The first thing she does is she instructs her daughters-in-law. She says, go back to the homes of your mothers. The second thing she does is she blesses them for their hesed, for their loving kindness that they showed to Naomi's deceased sons. And then she prays that God would be good to them and give them new husbands. So she instructs, she blesses, and then she prays. Naomi tries to kiss them goodbye, but of course they protest. No, Naomi, mother-in-law, we are coming with you. Who has a relationship like that with their mother-in-law? That's mostly a joke. They say they're going with her anyway, and this sets Naomi off in the second speech that she gives in this passage, and she gets gritty and real, and she plays out the logic of the situation. I have no sons for you to marry. I'm too old to have another husband, and even if I did, which is not possible, are you going to wait till I have new sons for you to marry? Of course not. It's a rhetorical question. Naomi plays out the hopelessness of the situation and her utter inability to do anything for her daughters-in-law. In summary, she says, staying with me will do nothing, which is why I've blessed you to go home. And then she adds this final piece. She says, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Naomi's expression of pain and frustration runs so deep that she perceives it to be valuable to pray God's blessing on her daughters-in-law, while at the same time believing that God's blessing is no longer on her. She's so deeply underwater in her own story that she can identify the possibility of grace for another, but not for herself. And I want to pause for a second and ask you, where are you seeing hope and possibility in another story, while at the same time you're feeling hopelessness and impossibility in your own story? That might be a place that merits a little bit of attention. So Orpah takes Naomi's very sensible advice and she goes away. But not Ruth. Out of some unimaginable, compassionate loyalty, Ruth insists on keeping her story linked to Naomi's. She makes this irrational choice, this upside-down choice, a move that I find even more strange because she commits not only to Naomi, but to Naomi's God. This is the same God that Naomi just said is against Naomi. That's a curious thing. And this passage concludes with Naomi and Ruth arriving in Bethlehem, in which Naomi again expresses the utter bitterness of her life. She's so bitter she's changing her name, and God's utter abandonment of her. This time she expresses that bitterness to old friends and family. Now, here's what makes preaching this passage a little bit tricky. This is a how the sausage gets made conversation. I imagine that most of us in this room have a sense for where this story goes. We know at least the rough details about how Naomi's situation, through Ruth, through Boaz, through God, is wildly redeemed beyond any possible imagination. Right? But recall that kitchen table that we sat at with Ruth and Orpah and Naomi a few minutes ago. It's so easy when we read narratives to skip right past the pain and the bitterness of this passage. But at least for a little bit here, I want us to put Boaz and the end of this book out of our heads. That's not the passage we're talking about today. Because what makes this section of the passage so relevant to us today is that Naomi is in the middle of her story, just like we are. She's experienced catastrophic life quakes. She can't see the future, and her imagination is so crushed by the pain and the hardship that has visited her that she can't even conceptualize praying a blessing for herself. It's all too clear to her perception, to her feelings, that God ain't helping her. All she can do is articulate the pain of where she is right there, right then, and bumble forward in uncertainty towards this glimmer of grace that she sees God giving the people of Judah. And I suspect that this is the same place that the disciples found themselves, huddled together in uncertainty, after everything seemed to fall apart and no future was imaginable for them either. And in so many ways, we're in exactly the same place in our lives. These waves of chaos and darkness and wickedness have washed over our best defenses. Things have happened. We find ourselves just like the 12 and just like Naomi in the middle of our stories without knowing the ending. So if Ruth is indeed wisdom literature, like Lori, who I first met as Dr. Brenner, explained last week, where is the wisdom in Ruth? Where's the hope for us in this passage? What are we being invited to do about the reality that life quakes happen? About the fact that we can't see the future? About the fact that we can't see how our stories will unfold? Well, I think this passage offers us two invitations for when we're sitting in the dark, shadowy middle of our stories. First, this passage from Ruth is an invitation to live into our reality, to acknowledge it, to speak honestly and directly to both God and to our community about where we are in our stories, to speak about what pain we are experiencing as the result of life quakes. We may complain bitterly when things are hard and painful, just like Naomi does. God is big enough for that. Don't whitewash the struggle. Acknowledge it. Ruth tells us that there is something of significant theological and psychological value in just being human. There is something deeply faithful about calling God to account when we believe that God has slighted us. God is big enough for that. There is a relationship in that. And second, this passage is an invitation to look for the barest glimmers of grace and then move towards those, even in the moments when our imaginations and our complaints lead us to believe that grace for ourselves is impossible. Naomi went to Judah because God was providing for other people there. In spite of the very real pain of her story, and in spite of her feeling that God was against her. And in the case of Ruth, moves towards grace by giving it. That's all she can see in front of her. Her decision to risk remaining with Naomi rather than sensibly returning home, like Orpah, is the decision that drives the rest of the book of Ruth. Moving towards grace, whether to receive it or to give it. As Lori said last week, our stories are not inconsequential. Our choices and our actions matter. So, coming back to where we started with this book, Bruce Feiler's book is really well summarized, actually, by the title. I do recommend you read the book, but the summary is that life is in the transitions. Our lives are in the transitions, just like Naomi's and Ruth's. Our lives are a series of little narratives, and we spend most of our time in the middle parts of those narratives, waiting, wondering, and bumbling forward. How will things play out? Where is God, and what is God doing? To this question, Eugene Peterson, who many people call the pastor's pastor, that's pretty meta, that's impressive. Eugene Peterson articulates, redemptive history is inventive and incorporative. And I would add imaginative. God's hesed or compassionate loyalty towards us is moving in ways that exceed not just our ability to see the future, but in ways that exceed our wildest dreams for what is possible. This is the moment when you can allow what you know as the rest of the narrative of Ruth to come rushing back in. So next time you find yourself standing back up after a disruptor or a life quake has hit, remember to tell the truth to God and the truth to your community. Speak directly, speak openly. God is not asking you to be a stoic. And remember to run or crawl, if that's all you can do, towards glimmers of grace, no matter how small those glimmers seem, and no matter how uncertain you are that they're for you. Because the God of the resurrection story is in your story with you. And that God is working out your redemption with a stunning inventiveness and imagination. Amen? Amen.